I've never been a racist. It's always been one of the deepest principles I've ever had. Even as a very young child in the 70s, when I went to nursery school, which I suppose is like kindergarten, and there was a Chinese kid in my class. I always thought that being racist, or just being nasty to the Chinese kid, was the most stupid, unkind and unfair thing you could do. And some of the other kids were nasty to him, and sometimes he got thumped. Sometimes he cried. So I've always hated it. Always. Even before I realised it had a name. Racism. I knew it was wrong. And it still is. As I grew through adolescence and into a man, and began to learn the history of the Caribbean and Asian people in our midst, my conviction that it was wrong hardened. I realised that they had had a rough time, to put it mildly, since coming to Britain in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And so my sympathies tended to be with them and against anybody who was threatening them. And because I was interested in them, in their experiences, I learned quite a bit about them. And I was always interested in what they had to say. And some of what they had to say wasn't always easy to take. My patriotism had to take a few body blows. Not as many as it's taking at the moment, to be sure, but enough. Enough to make me feel guilty. Yeah, I had more than my share of white guilt, even though I would tend to take the side, enough that I would tend to take the side of the black or the brown person. And this guilt was not without some basis. I was, of course, not personally responsible, but there was something significant in the history of Caribbean people in particular. In those far-off days when Britain had an empire, part of the official rationale of empire was, and I cringe to say it now, to be a civilising influence. Of course it was patronising, but it wasn't as if it was ineffective. A culture of Britishness was instilled in the Caribbean colonies, instilled enough to encourage tens of thousands of British West Indians to fight for the mother country. Most were prevented from serving on the front line, but many repeatedly applied for combat roles. In any case, the RAF in particular relied heavily on West Indian mechanics and other ground roles, which could be argued were as important as the combat pilots themselves. And culturally, they were British. They would tell stories where the happy ending was them sailing off to England, and they thought of themselves as superior to the inferior French, Dutch and Spanish West Indians. And they were so loyal to Britain, loyal first to the King and then to the Queen. And they had been treated relatively well in wartime Britain, at least compared to black American servicemen who were still segregated in the US forces. And they saw how white British people came to the aid of those black Americans when white Americans tried to enforce the colour bar. So when the war was over, most returned home, but as the labour shortage in the UK intensified, they were invited back, most visibly to become nurses and bus conductors. But it wasn't like wartime. It wasn't like before. Then they were helping to defeat the Nazis. Now some thought they were coming to take our jobs. Immigration was rapid and the numbers were high as word got back to the Caribbean of a better life. And there was nothing to stop them. As part of instilling the belief in the empire, they were all British subjects and as such had a right to come to the UK. So tensions rose as the numbers rose, and a 20 to 30 year struggle for acceptance on both sides ensued. Riots in Notting Hill, Brixton, Toxteth came and went, and gradually it quietened down. One of the things that I remember, and one of the things that endeared me to West Indians, was the high number of young black men who were called Winston. I don't think it's ever been mentioned, but I always took it as a sign that they wanted to belong. They wanted to belong enough that they flattered us by calling their sons after our greatest hero. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, not being black myself. but it seems obvious to me. So there was a reason for my white guilt, a genuine one. Those West Indians were so eager to belong, to join the team. And how did we respond? Well, pretty poorly. Naked aggression, open discrimination, police brutality, and all the other stuff, too numerous to mention. I mean, we invited them, for Christ's sake, and then we treated them like shit when they got here. There was even a Conservative Party slogan in the 50s that read, "If you want a nigger neighbour, vote Labour." Seems unbelievable now, but there it is. So I had a gut reaction against racism, and then I had a more sophisticated and informed opposition to it. And generally that still stands. And why shouldn't it? I mean, racism is moronic when its raison d'etre is just physical difference. There's very little that's as stupid as that. So you hate black people? Okay, what about someone who's half black, say, with a white father and a black mother? Do you hate them too? Or do you just hate the 50% of them? Just the black half, right? And where's the join? Or what about somebody a quarter black with one black grandparent? Do you hate them completely? Or only the 25%? What about someone with 1/8 black in them, or a 16th? Where do you draw the line? So that kind of racism is not only unkind and moronic, it's also illegal. Well, I guess that comes under moronic. It's also illogical, rather, and I guess that comes under moronic. But the definition of racism has grown. It's grown to include all sorts of groups and things, and ethnicities and cultures and religions and national identities and even political positions. And this is not accidental. It has grown to include almost everything that is not the normal, the average, the usual, the median, or the majority in European countries, or those countries that are now largely populated with European stock. Most people are not racist, because most people are reasonable thinking individuals with a moral compass who can also apply logic to the opinions that they have. And most people don't like racists because they seem to be people that do not have these qualities, and understandably they don't wish to be associated with them. But this aversion to racism has been exploited. It has been exploited to a ridiculous and frankly to a reprehensible degree. It has been exploited to such an extent that some people would rather allow underage girls, children in fact, to be gang raped rather than be accused of racism. I am, of course, talking about the Telford scandal. I have for the last 2 years been living without a television, mainly so this kind of sickness is not broadcast into my living room at all hours of the day, so I don't get the jump on these stories as quickly as maybe I used to. So I'm not particularly clued up on the details, but judging by the experiences of perhaps another dozen British towns, it appears that gangs of predatory, adult, exclusively Pakistani Muslim men have been successfully and repeatedly raping pubescent and underage, exclusively ethnically white British girls. And they've been doing it for years. Doing it for years while the so-called nanny state looked the other way. Ignoring for a moment the obvious horror of what has been happening, what strikes me as significant, as someone who is always railing against the overmighty state that seems to be surveilling everyone, everywhere, every second of every day. And yet they don't seem to have spotted this. I mean, where was the nanny state when it was really needed? If ever there was an occasion that a nanny state was needed, surely this was it. Surely this was the time when civil niceties and civil liberties were swept aside. As you will have gathered so far, I object to the sinister nature of the surveillance state. But perhaps I also ought to be objecting to its incompetence. I mean, that's a combination to be proud of in our public services, isn't it? Both sinister and incompetent. Jesus wept. So let's talk about the men. if you can call them that. Why do they do it? And why do they do it almost exclusively to white girls? Well, first off, it's because they're arseholes. You get arseholes everywhere, of course, but the kind of arseholes elsewhere who do these kinds of things do at least know that it's wrong, and because they know it's wrong, they keep it hidden. They do it in secret. They get into the confidences of the children themselves and inveigle themselves into positions where they are trusted, and then they strike. What they don't do is roam in packs, because they suspect that there are no packs like that, and that if they revealed themselves to a pack, they're more than likely to end up getting their heads kicked in. Unless, of course, that there is a pack that they know that thinks just like them. And that's where the Muslim, rather than the Asian or perhaps even the Pakistani part comes in, because these men were of Asian descent, but they categorically were not Sikhs, they were not Hindus, and they were not Buddhists. And we owe the Sikhs, Hindus and Buddhists that explicit distinction. It wasn't them, it was Muslims, exclusively. So why do Muslims do this when others do not? It's a cultural thing, a culturally Muslim thing. When you see a Muslim woman in full black chador or burqa or hijab, what is that saying? Nothing? No. No, it's not saying nothing. It's saying something. It's saying, or bellowing more like, without actually saying it. It's saying, our women are chaste, modest and virtuous. Your women, however, are disgusting Western whores. And by implication, they deserve everything they get. And in a strange and fucked up way, it's not surprising that they think that. It's what they've been taught after all. Just as they're taught that if one of their daughters or sisters disgraces the family by rejecting a forced marriage, for instance, or maybe getting a white or a black boyfriend, then it's completely okay to beat her to death or to throw acid in her face. And if we, as the British state, do nothing, which is mostly what we have been doing, to correct this abomination, then it must mean that we don't disagree, or at least that we are so weak, or that we have so little conviction in our own moral code that we can be safely ignored. For instance, female genital mutilation, the noble practice of slicing off a young girl's clitoris so that she can never enjoy the God-given pleasure of sex, has been outlawed in Britain since 1986. As far as I'm aware, there has been only one conviction of this crime. One conviction in 32 years. God save the Queen, huh? So this behaviour is more than abhorrent, but there are people in this case that have been behaving even worse. And what could be worse than that? Well, the people whose job it is to stop this kind of thing, namely the police, the social services and all the other council and local government officials who simply look the other way. There is a well-known case here in England, well, it's well known now since somebody blew the lid off it, of the police force's penetration of a group of animal rights activists. Now I'm assuming this was a particularly radical and dedicated group who the police thought required their attentions. Now, passions can get pretty high regarding animal rights, particularly here in Britain. But I've never heard of anything more serious than graffiti, vandalism and sabotage in the context of human rights. It's probably safe to say they were conspiring to break some laws, and perhaps even break some windows. But it's scarcely earth-shattering, is it? There was no prospect of murder or rape or kidnapping in their activities, and it could hardly ever have been described as any threat to national security. And yet, the police thought it serious enough to embed several undercover police officers for years into the group to keep an eye on their activities. For years this went on, with the agents building false identities, getting tattoos to look the part, providing vehicles and money, provided by the taxpayer of course, establishing friendships and romantic relationships with these activists, and even, in a few cases, fathering children, even though they have families themselves. And all this to keep a bunch of dedicated, but fairly ineffectual animal rights advocates under surveillance. And yet, with credible and numerous reports of underage girls being gang raped all over the country, not a single investigation was launched, not a single suspect was questioned, and it seems not a single solitary plainclothes policeman was ordered to sit in an unmarked car outside a kebab shop and watch what was going on. What were they doing? And where was the surveillance state while all this was going on? The all-seeing eyes that are supposed to keep us safe. Where were they when they were needed? Or were they too busy checking unpaid parking tickets? Now, someone very close to me is involved, up to her neck in all these kinds of things. She attends endless meetings and receives memos and emails and edicts constantly about vulnerable groups and safeguarding and intervening to protect minors. She's also bombarded with endless exhortations regarding diversity, but that's another matter. The whole philosophy of her workplace is geared to being ever watchful about the people under their care. It is constant, so constant it makes her brain ache. So where was that philosophy in Telford? Not to mention all the other places where this has been happening. What were their meetings like? Try as I might, I can't begin to imagine what the meetings of the meetings were like. What was said, what was not said. After what was said, how was the decision reached to do nothing? How would they have got there? Or rather not got there? I mean, try and help me imagine this. One minor official, perhaps in the front line, says something like, I have been receiving reports that underage girls are being sexually exploited in the town. What's the response? Well, maybe, I don't know, something like this. Perhaps something like this. That sounds serious, Councillor. Please tell us more about these reports. They might then follow up with, we need to know what girls you're talking about so that we can set up some safeguarding procedures. Then we can inform the police so that they can monitor the situation, covertly perhaps, to establish whether there is any validity to these claims, and perhaps call in these men for questioning and maybe make some arrests. Due to the seriousness of these claims, it is incumbent upon us, as public servants, to prioritise this case and proceed with all haste, with all the resources available to us and with the full force of the law. Would that sound reasonable? Is that what you might expect of social services and the police force? Or perhaps it went something like this. I have been receiving reports that underage girls are being sexually exploited in the town. Oh, where did these claims originate, Councillor? From the girls themselves. And what girls are those? Well, the girls from the so-and-so poor working class area. I see. The area with lots of social problems, unemployment, drug use and teenage pregnancies. That area, you mean? Yes. And who are the supposed perpetrators, Councillor? Well, it seems if they are mostly adult Asian men. Asian men? Yes, Pakistani men, Muslims. You do understand, Councillor. You do understand, Councillor, that those are very serious allegations. I suppose they are. And you understand that such allegations could inflame racial tensions in that part of town. I suppose they could, but I thought the safety of the girls was more important. Of course, Councillor. But are these girls, how shall I put it, prone to what one might regard as promiscuous behaviour? Might this activity be consensual, considering their backgrounds? They're children, some as young as 12, they're underage. Under law, they can't consent. I understand your concern, Councillor, and you ought to be applauded for it, but we must give due regard to public safety and to harmonious race relations. We wouldn't want any of the racial tensions that blight our inner cities to infect our little town, would we now? I suppose not. Precisely. And we thank you for your input. Now, the next item on the agenda is the roadworks in the High Street. Is that how it went down? I suppose we'll know when we see the minutes. If it is, then this is even worse than the actions of the child rapists themselves. It's worse because it was these people's duty to protect those girls. It's worse because these people put other things above the welfare of those girls. It's worse because these people thought it would be preferable to pander to the Muslim population's image of themselves than to tell the truth. A truth that the majority of the normal, sane, privately devout and community-minded Muslims would be absolutely horrified to learn had been going on. It's worse because these people didn't think that those girls were deserving of their protection. And it's worse because, on some level, conscious or not, these people agreed with the vile child rapists themselves. Namely that these girls weren't defenceless children, but that they were complicit, that their actions were consensual. Those kind of girls were just like that. So this is why it's worse. It's worse because these people didn't think these girls were children. They thought they were just whores. They were just slags who deserved everything they got. You see, they were just like that. They weren't like our precious daughters, our princesses. They thought, just as the predators themselves thought, that they were nothing but disgusting Western whores. But hey, at least these people weren't racists. Thank fucking God for that. So calling out this behaviour is not racist. It's not even slightly racist. But even if it were, it would still be preferable than turning a blind eye to the gang rape of children. So even though I hate it as much as I ever did, if Telford tells us anything, it's this: there are worse things than racism.